Picture the scene, if you will. Two armies facing each other across a large dusty plain. There's no sound except the occasional jingle of harness until trumpets break the stillness. The first army's bowmen pull back their strings and release a volley of arrows towards the enemy. Then their troops march forward 10 paces, 20, 30. They stop at 40. Now the other army likewise pull back their bowstrings and let forth several volleys to rain down on their enemies. And then their troops in turn march forward 10 paces, 20, 30, 40, and then they stop. This is not how battles happened, right? Yet on the tabletop, it's quite common to see this sort of thing. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're talking about activation. Hi, I'm Rob Hoyton. Thanks for joining me today, where no doubt, as you can see, I'm doing some filming for my We Want the Gold skirmish game. Over this whole weekend, I'm going to be filming some tutorials, introductions to the game, and some gameplay as well. Now, when I wrote the rules, most of it was pretty straightforward. So things like the movement, visibility, combat, how to use spells, what creatures to put in, all that was reasonably straightforward, having played a lot of different RPGs and skirmish games and all the rest of it. But the area that gave me the most pause for thought was in activation. So what I thought I'd do today is talk about some different types of activation, some options and alternatives within those, and then also let you know which one I chose for my game and why. So, let's begin. Those of you who are regulars here will know that I started my tabletop wargaming in the mid-70s. Gladiatorial Combat was my very first game, but very quickly got into tabletop World War II games. And the rules we used were 1925 to 1950 Armour and Infantry by the War Games Research Group. These were actually published in June 1973. And when you look through these, there's no talk of activation. What you tended to get in these older rules, there's a lot about ground scale and time scale and that sort of thing. But activation wasn't really considered. Everything was I go, you go. I think this was the same under most sets of rules at the time. Now, this is quite natural, I suppose, because most of us know chess. We would have been taught chess, or at least drafts or checkers at some time, which, chess in some ways outside of a war game is close to a war game as you can get, or at least a board game. It's a confrontational, it's attack and defense. And I think when you then switch from something like chess into war games, I go, you go, seems like a natural thing to do. But is it the best? On the positive side, I go, you go is very straightforward because I go, I move all my pieces, I do all my firing, then I sit back and puff my pipe while you go and you do the same thing. So in that sense, everyone knows what's happening. You don't have to keep track of which units have moved and which have fired and all that sort of thing. Everything is just done in one go, and then it's the other side's turn. So this is good, but the downside is, well, let's take World War II as an example. You might have a tank unit position there, and the enemy has their turn, and they march right across your line of sight. They come into sight and they go out of sight, and your tanks sit there watching them going, oh, we can't fire at the moment because it's not our turn. So, things like that can be an issue. It also means that perhaps there's an advantage or a disadvantage to going first or going second. It depends on the circumstances, I guess. But sometimes, you want to watch and see how your opponent's army is moving, and then you can think, oh, right, well, what I'm going to do is nip in through that gap that's opened up. And the other guy can't respond, the other player can't respond until it's their turn. So there's a couple of ways you can get around this, and these were things that started coming in, I found, with that I go, you go system. The first is that you build into the rules some form of reaction. So if a target presents itself during the other player's turn, you get the opportunity to go, oh, hang on a minute, my tanks, my archers, or whatever are pointing that way, they're watching that space, they get to fire at that point in the other player's turn. That's one possibility. Another thing that started coming in a lot was the idea of writing orders, particularly for larger scale battles. Now, orders can work in different ways. You can, of course, give your whole army general orders at the start. So this wing of the army is going to take that hill. The center of the army is going to stay put here. This wing of the army is going to protect the flank, that kind of thing. Then, of course, within that, as the battle develops, you might get more detailed orders. All right, that wing, actually, you're going to break into two. The cavalry are going here. The archers are going this way. All that kind of stuff. So, there's probably at least two levels of orders and possibly more. Depends how far down you want to go the pecking order, from the generalissimo at the top to the corporal on the sharp end. Now, I mentioned writing orders there, so this took us into our next method, which started to develop, I guess, into the late 70s, which was simultaneous movement. Both sides write down orders, both sides then reveal those orders, and everything moves kind of at the same time. What we normally used to do was start on the left side of the table and work across. So all the units on that side would be moving. You get this sort of wave comes across the table, this Mexican wave of movement. And of course, any firing or melee, etc., is taken care of as it happens, so to speak. So the advantage of this method is your units can react much quicker. It feels like you're working more in real time. You're reacting to events as they happen rather than wait for them to happen and finish and then move. You can actually be responding. The other aspect of this that I always liked was you have to be very precise and thoughtful in your orders, because suddenly, you're taking your cavalry off this way, and suddenly that big gap has opened up, and your opponent can now take advantage of that. If he has written something to that effect in his orders, it might be that he's ordered his cavalry to go across that way, and they have to march across to the left, looking wistfully over to the right, where this big gap has opened up. So you can, again, depending what level of detail you want to add in, put in something about reactions. Orders can be changed kind of halfway through. I'm sure there's been many famous instances we can think of where cavalry charge and they're just getting up to the enemy and they're recalled, for example. So you can build things like that in, which makes for, I think, probably a more realistic game in some ways. However, the disadvantage then with this approach is it can slow down gameplay, especially if you've got a larger battle, especially if you've got a lot of units, because you start, as I said, on one side of the table, you've got this going on here, then we've got to resolve all of that, and by the time you get across to the other side, 45 minutes has passed. Now, that may be okay. That may be okay. It may be that that's exactly the sort of battle you're looking for and you want that real detail, nitty gritty. It may be you've only got 2 hours to play a game, in which case perhaps this isn't the method to use. Where we found that writing orders like this worked very well was particularly when we were doing our samurai skirmish games. So you have maybe 20 to 30 figures aside, and they're in 2 or 3 groups. And it was very easy. You had an order sheet and you might just write down an arrow to indicate direction of movement, or you might say keeping overwatch on a particular area, or it might be retreat or whatever. And within that, because it was a skirmish game, you're working with individual figures, you have that option to add that reactive aspect in quite easily as well. So yeah, I think for a skirmish game, that's perhaps a good one. If you're looking at World War II, something platoon size maybe. If you're looking at anything bigger than that, then I think you're going to be there fighting your battle for quite a while. Let's move on then to the third main method, as far as I can see, which is where individual units or figures, depending on the scale you're playing, are activated most often at random. So games like Fistful of Lead Reloaded use a card system, which I liked very much. I've had a few games of that with Ove down at the club. Now, the good thing with that playing card system is you can also assign other things to those cards. So each faction is represented by a suit, but if a queen of any suit is drawn, then that might give you a bonus to aiming and firing, for example. That sort of thing can be added in very easily. The only disadvantage is, of course, there's only 4 suits in a deck. The other random activation method I'm very familiar with is drawing a counter from a bag. Here, of course, you're not restricted to 4 suits. You can have as many colours as you can think of. What you generally have is one army or one side will be a particular colour. If they've got 20 units, you put 20 counters, red counters in the bag. Same for the other team. If you draw out a red counter, red gets to activate 1 unit. If you draw the green counter, green gets to activate 1 unit, and so on. And you go through until all the counters are out, everything's been activated, and then you start again. So that's a very simple system, and it sort of sits somewhere between the I go, you go, and in the simultaneous, in that we are just working 1 unit at a time. But there can be issues with this as well, certainly with some rule sets. So it works very well in Fantastic Battles, for example, which is our favoured rule set for large-scale fantasy battles in 10mm. Prior to that, I tried War Master, which has a similar mechanic. However, it can be the case in War Master and some other games that I've seen that use this system, where a unit might not activate at all. This, to me, I don't know. I didn't like this so much, especially when you got situations where, for example, you might have a unit or even a few units that don't do anything for 2 or 3 turns at a time. So your opponent sweeps across the field and smashes into your orcs or whatever it is, and your heavy cavalry are just sitting there going, "Oh, look at that over there. God, I don't know, hey." God. You know, now, of course, we know that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and sometimes units might wander off or they might not want to advance, all that sort of thing. But I feel that there's better ways to build that concept into a game rather than just randomly having random units not moving at all for no apparent reason. So I do prefer that as in Fantastic Battles, where, as I said, if you've got X units, X counters going, everyone and everything gets to move. Of course, there are morale issues where if they take losses, they might retreat. If they're out of command range of their general or their leader, then, things might not happen as planned. But everything does get to have something happen or take some action. There is one other method I'm familiar with that I've only seen it in one game. Perhaps it's in others. I would be interested to hear. And it is, well, really, it was designed as a naval simulator. I'm talking about Starfleet Battles, of course, which runs an impulse system. So in Starfleet Battles, you control a starship in the Star Trek universe, or starships if you really want to torture your brain. You allocate energy at the start of each turn to your shields, your weapons, etc., and of course to your movement. The maximum movement speed is 32 hexes, so a turn is divided into 32 impulses. If you're going speed 32, you move in every impulse. You can fire your weapons at any point during those 32 impulses. If you're moving at 16, then you're moving on every other impulse. So the clever people there have come up with this chart and this system that, for me, really works well, at least in that context. Everyone is involved because, I'm going to be moving in a moment, unless you move in speed 1, of course, in which case you're probably going to be out of the game very soon anyway. But it does bring in this really nice edge and really builds this tension between movement and fire. What's the right point to fire? Because of course every ship has arcs of fire, every ship has shields. Can I get him on the damage shield? Is he going to turn there? Do I fire here? So that impulse system for that style of play works really well. And that's why, to my mind, Starfleet Battles is the best board game out there ever. Yeah, I'm going to die on that hill. A couple of other mechanics I've seen in various types of activation are things like random movement, random speed. Again, not something I'm a fan of. I think it might have been Achtung Panzer, but I'm not sure, where when you got to move, you rolled a couple of d6 to see how far you could move. Again, to me, I get the idea of, yeah, you might go into a ditch or whatever it is, but I'd prefer other ways to build that in rather than have that every time. Every time you move, you might only be going 2 centimeters as opposed to 20. I feel like then it's taken a lot of agency away from me as a player, commander, general, whatever. So those are the main activation mechanics I can think of. I'm sure there are some others as well. Is there a best one? Well, it's a bit like saying what's better, a bike or a tractor? Depends if you want to nip somewhere on a bike or if you've got to pull something out of a ditch. So there is no overall better mechanic, of course. It's all down to what type of game you're playing and the style of play that you prefer. And I think for all of us, whatever type of game we're playing, whether it's a teeny tiny skirmish on a 2 foot square board, whether you're playing on a 24 foot by 18 foot table with thousands of troops, we're all looking for pretty much the same thing. We've got to get this balance of playability, realism, and a sense of control as well. Now, I don't think any of us would say we want full control over everything that's happening on the table, because that then takes away from the realism. By the same token, as I mentioned before, if as a commander you're sitting there and half your army is not moving at all or doing anything, or, oh look, they only get to move so far this turn, that kind of takes me out of the game, really. I'm looking for something where I could be involved. Everything flows reasonably quickly. I'm not sitting around for an hour waiting for the other general to make his mind up and do all his movement and everything else. We've got this back and forth going, and most of all, I'm invested in what's going on. So then, what did I choose for We Want the Gold? Well, the main issue I came up with is, one of the main reasons I wrote the rules in the first place, really, was most games are two-sided. You might have more than 2 players on each side, but generally, if we're talking fantasy, we've got the orcs are raiding into dwarf territory, for example. So we've got 2 groups and they're going to have a fight in the forest, try and capture the crossroads, whatever it is, that sort of stuff. In We Want the Gold, we can have up to 5 people playing, each controlling a faction of usually 5 characters. Now, they're not necessarily working against each other or together. It's somewhere in between the two. So most wargame scenarios are A and B meet and they fight over an objective. Most RPGs are, we're a group of 8 adventurers and we've got a magic user and we've got a fighter, we've got a thief. We go and explore this place and we work as a unit, generally, not always, generally. With this, we've got somewhere between the two because it's tabletop, but at the same time, your group has their own aims and objectives. Now, they might align with other groups on the table. They might be directly in opposition. So we get a lot of interplay between the groups, a lot of passing of notes, a lot of whispering in the corner, this kind of thing, which brings in that RPG element. If you think of films like the spaghetti westerns, for example, it's that sort of feel. They're normally 3-sided. I think the classic Clint Eastwood ones, certainly the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that sort of thing. You've got 3 antagonists. Who's going to back who? Who's going to double cross who? That's very much the sort of feeling I wanted for this. So an I go, you go wouldn't really work. I did consider the impulse system, but I'm not sure that I'm clever enough to make that work with figures, where you've got 5 figures each, as opposed to ships. The the overall feel and mechanics of the game are quite different. But it's something I'm going to return to in the future because it is such a great method. So in the end, I went with counter activation. If you've got 5 characters, you get 5 counters in the bag. They're all drawn out one by one. You get to activate a character of choice. And incidentally, I think that is another positive with that form of activation is you get to activate whichever character or unit you want to. So you're not restricted to, oh, if I take this out, then I have to do this and this. So that gives you that element of flexibility within the structure of the turn to think, oh, do I move this character here? Or now, what's this character do? Are they going to charge at that necromancer and try and bash him over the head? Or are they going to hide behind the wall? And what we've found is even with, well, 25, 30 figures on the table, by the time you add in some of the creatures, this was quick moving as well. Because the game, in a sense, is quite cinematic. As I said, you're making a snap decision. Do I go through that door or do I go this way? Do I look here? Oh, someone's coming to attack me. I better turn and defend. So it's not like when a counter is drawn, we don't get a lot of chin stroking. Now, if I consider this, perhaps this. And if we do, then the game master should say, come on, you've got 10 seconds. What are you going to do? That method of activation and that style of play, I find keeps everything moving nice and quickly. Everyone gets a turn, everyone is invested in what's going on. And of course, when another character does something extremely silly or something that doesn't quite work out, everyone else gets a good laugh as well. So there we go. I think those are the 3 main, or 4 if we count the impulse, methods of activation in tabletop war games. Are there any others? Are there any strange hybrids out there that I don't know about? What have you found works best for you and in which particular type of game as well? So, yeah, do let me know. As always, it's always great to hear from people. Pop a comment down below. If you haven't already, please do like, share, and subscribe. The channel is really starting to grow now, so that's great. I want to keep that going into next year. Got lots of new ideas for the channel. And of course, We Want the Gold, that series I mentioned, that will be appearing on here. The rules will hopefully be ready for publishing next month, September. I certainly want to get them ready for the Innsmouth Literary Festival, where we shall be running our first demo and participation games as well. If you come into that, do pop over and join in. You might get to fight some deep ones. You might get to be a deep one. Who knows? Let's not go there. All right, thanks again for watching. See you soon.